So great, welcome. We are really glad you're here. This is the Social Data Science Center Seed Grant Series Symposium at the University of Maryland. This is the last in our session for this academic year, and we're really thrilled to have these scholars available to update us on the general project that kind of fits this overall vision that we have for the center and how it supports the social sciences across campus. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the SoDa website starting next week. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please use the Q&A feature at any time during the talks to write in your questions. If you'd like the opportunity to ask your question live, please make a note of that and we'll call on you and we can unmute you during the Q&A portion. Otherwise, I'll handle the questions for the panel. So I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. We'll start off with Charlie Harry. So Charlie's a senior leader and practitioner and researcher with over 20 years of experience in intelligence and cyber operations. He's the co-director of the Center for Governance of Technology and Systems, GoTech, and the associate research professor in the School of Public Policy. He also holds a joint appointment in the College of Information and serves as the operations director for the university's Maryland Global Initiative for Cybersecurity, or MAGIC. Another great speaker series. He's also a senior research associate at the Center for International Security Studies at Maryland and an affiliate with the Applied Research Library for Intelligence and Security. Charlie has a lot of offices. Mr. Harry's responsible research focuses on categorization and measurement of effects of cyber attack as a means of enabling public policymakers to assess strategic risks and assess the consequences of strategic cyber attack. He's joined by Bill Lucyshyn. Bill is a research professor and co-director of GoTech with Charlie in the School of Public Policy here at Maryland. He's authored numerous reports, book chapters, and journal articles on the economics of cybersecurity, the sustainment of complex systems, identifying public sector acquisition best practices, and public-private sector partnering. Previously, Ms. Lucyshyn served as a program manager and principal technical advisor at DARPA on the identification, selection, research, development, and prototype production of advanced technology projects. Prior to that, he completed a 25-year career in the U.S. Air Force, serving in various operations, staff, and acquisitions positions. They will be presenting the project today, and our discussant, we're honored to have Netta Squires joining us. So Netta is the Director of Local Cybersecurity for the state of Maryland. Director Squires is a crisis management specialist, experienced in legal compliance and emergency management planning, cybersecurity, public health, and mass care. We are thrilled to have you here and eager to hear the research ahead. So I will pass the baton to Charlie and Bill.
Great, thanks a lot, Wayne. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you very much, Netta, for being here. I'm going to go ahead and just pull this up, and I'm going to try to do not be alarmed by the number of slides. I will try to run this gauntlet in a fairly quick manner. What we're going to talk about today is really kind of trying to understand one part of cybersecurity risk at scale, to try to maybe illuminate on this question that we posed here, that, do county demographics shape exposure to cyber harm? And a lot of this really kind of boils down to general concerns that policymakers have around this idea of vulnerability and understanding the potential cascading effects on critical infrastructure, basically the systems that support modern life as we know it: water systems, power grids, voting systems, all the things that we've kind of come to take for granted, and how IT systems kind of support all this in the background. Now, all of this research that Bill and I and others at GoTech really focus on, and some of our other colleagues in the Information Studies College, or the Information College, is of paramount importance to national policymakers. And when we take a look at kind of the larger U.S. strategy tied around cybersecurity, we follow this kind of strategic approach of what is termed layered deterrence. And layered deterrence was coined coming out of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission report in 2020, which is kind of the the bicameral, bipartisan national strategy for dealing with the issue of cybersecurity. And very specifically within layered deterrence, that there's this idea of denying benefits to attackers. And a lot of that is going to be focused around the idea of building a risk management plan. And so the challenge is for policymakers is, our ability to actually measure risk, to actually understand risk at a scaled level is actually really difficult. And in fact, has thus far eluded the US government. And even though this is about 4 years old now, I assure you that this still is a problem. And so really, it's one of the major challenges in cybersecurity policy. So when we think about kind of national risk, CISA, the Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency, it's the agency under the Department of Homeland Security that really kind of thinks about cybersecurity across all 16 critical infrastructures, focuses around what are often called national critical functions. And these are the things that support kind of, modern day life, things that connect, things that distribute, manage, supply. And what we're planning on doing in this project, or what we've been doing in this project, is really kind of focus first and foremost around the idea of state and primarily county government functions that relate to this kind of critical infrastructure. So public school boards, water systems, property tax collection, voter registration are all examples of kind of key services that are oftentimes managed by county governments. So as a more practical matter, we see examples where the federal government is trying to get its hands around this issue by typically what the federal government does, which is throw money at the problem. So this idea of, can we fund better defense, and can we get that as close as possible to the problem? This idea that we might be able to fund significant defense at the state and local level. And so as a practical matter here in Maryland, Maryland has received about $6.5 million through this one particular federal program that's gone into this program that effectively can provide grants to support broader defense. And so the broader question for the state of Maryland is, okay, where should we actually focus those resources? Where should we best allocate the resources to promote broader cybersecurity to defend these kind of critical systems? And so this kind of leads us to, some of the goals of this project, which are, can we at a scaled level think about the size and the complexity of what we know as the national attack surface for county government systems? And more specifically, does any knowledge about the population size and its composition really give us any insight about any potential impact to what we would call cyber harm? I'll come back to that in a minute. And so, do we find a relationship between populations, population composition, including race and income and education? Do we actually know if we know something about the makeup of the population? Does that give us any real insight about what the size and complexity of the attack surface really looks like? And so what we're really talking about here is blending kind of two major areas. We're going to look at a lot of technical data about the technical systems that support these kind of core areas. And then we also want to know a little bit more about population characteristics, maybe as a determinant for the security posture. So, obviously the first thing we want to do is take a look at what other people are doing and see where there might be gaps or where we can contribute unique insight. And so what we started off doing was kind of really pulsing the literature to try to identify what other people were doing. And we were not very successful in finding a lot of work that was focused on this kind of public investment and scaled view of cybersecurity. This idea that, can I understand what the cybersecurity vulnerability or risk is at scale across the entire country by individual communities? There are some surveys that are done, but they're very, very narrow and very specific to maybe one or two jurisdictions. What we do see are kind of two major streams. We see stream one, a lot of focus on kind of cybersecurity determinants and demographic determinants of cybersecurity, but it's really done at the individual levels. So understanding income, understanding race, how does that potentially relate to the willingness or ability to prevent certain cyber attacks. So that's kind of one stream of literature that we see that demonstrates that there is some sort of correlation between these factors. The second stream, which was probably a little bit more specific to this particular project, is looking at the growing evidence between marginalized communities and what they face in terms of access to critical resources and amenities and other critical systems. And here we do find quite a bit of research that's been done that speaks to how differences in demographic characteristics amongst people in different communities, they do face different access. So what we wanted to be able to do is try to blend in a couple of different streams of literature and then bring in kind of our new approach to see if we might be able to at least explore some of the initial areas of kind of this more strategic view of cybersecurity. So what's our approach? So we're trying to do something here that's not very easy, which is to really kind of blend a more technical analysis of networks and kind of what we're seeing and some of their vulnerabilities, and then kind of bring in the more social, the social science elements where we're looking at population characteristics and maybe doing some more inferential statistics to be able to see if we can maybe, make some at least some exploratory judgments about what we think is actually going on here. So one side of this is we're going to look at the network infrastructure to really kind of start to construct our dependent variables. And so we're going to look at things like enumerated IT infrastructure, the exposed software services on them, vulnerabilities potentially to it. And then the other side of this is going to be the population characteristics. So to really just kind of focus on the dependent variables, what we first we had to overcome here was the fact that there is no single owner of IT infrastructure around the country. Their local decisions are being made at the county and state level that can oftentimes have emergent consequences. And so what you're actually looking at is a set of interdependent but independent organizations that effectively construct what we would call a integrated attack surface. So what we mean by attack surface is really just the devices and computers that we can see on the internet from the outside looking in. So we are not doing any sort of scanning of internal computers. We're not hacking our way, into networks. What we're looking at is just an outside in view and trying to identify if there might be potential areas of vulnerability. So what we did, like any good social science, group, we built a Python app. And I say that a little tongue in cheek, but effectively what we did is we built an application. And so a lot of this work expands off some work that I've done with Dr. Ido Sivan Sevilla and Mr. McDermott on a separate project, but we have pioneered kind of this integrated attack surface mapping technique. And so through this approach, what we've done is we've collected over 3,100 county networks information. So effectively what we do is we put together a bunch of web domains and we use publicly available scanning databases that we're able to compile all this data. And it's roughly 42,000 computers worth of information that we're able to bring together. And we're able to ascertain what exposed software services are there and maybe even potential vulnerabilities. I'll come back to that in a sec. So obviously there's some clear limitations to this approach. We're only looking, from the outside in. So we're not able to make any judgments whatsoever about vulnerability of internal network systems, but we are at least able to identify if there maybe are open doors or open windows that an attacker might be able to come into. The other side of this is the population characteristics that we wanted to take a look at. Things like population counts and composition, including race and income. And we went to, some very kind of standard data sources. We took a look at the United States Census and the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and looked across a variety of different measures for population, for race, for income, education, and other measures, including access to broadband and computer systems. So just real quick, when we took a look at kind of the initial size of this integrated attack surface, we were looking at roughly 3,100. It's about 99% of all county governments. We find kind of an uneven distribution, as you might expect, of computer systems. So there isn't a standard number of computers that are exposed on the internet. In some cases, we find really, really large attack surfaces. In other cases, we find relatively small ones. And we look at those across a variety of different regions. There's a lot of regional differences. So for instance, we see like in California, driving attack surface size in FEMA Region 9, which is on the west coast of the United States. So bottom line, when it comes to the size of the attack surface, there really is not a one-size-fits-all sort of situation. For this particular project, where we looked at some of the demographic characteristics and its determinants, we actually deep dove into a sample of 6 states, so roughly 12% of all U.S. states, and looked at about 8% of the counties across the United States. And so, as you can see from these ridgeline charts, is that while lots of things are left skewed, there's just a few outliers to the right. In some cases, you find relatively small states like Maryland actually having a fairly distinct profile from what you would see from even larger states like Florida. You see Maryland's got a much more skewed distribution just for IP addresses than other places. So typically what we find, and you're going to see this here in a second, is that more populous counties, more populous areas tend to have larger attack surfaces. And so we can start to maybe make some judgments about cyber harm when we look at some of these characteristics. So what drives attack surface size? Basically, population size and income seem to drive the primary deployment of digital infrastructure. So I've got a facet map here, and you can see it by state that there's this broader relationship. We get this kind of correlation coefficient, that's that shows a relatively strong, kind of positive correlation between population and IP count. And we see that when we do our regression on the county IP count, you see significance in population as well as income. That's really not that surprising. Larger populations are tied to larger deployments of infrastructure. And so the question, one of the things we have is, are there any nuances? And specifically, we wanted to ask this question of, how race might factor into the size of the attack surface, which may lead to an exposure of additional cyber harm. I'm going to come back to what we mean by that in a second. What we find here is that counties that have higher percentages of white persons as a total population of the county is associated with actually fewer IP addresses, right? So there's a negative relationship. As you increase the percentage of white persons in the county, there's actually a decline in deployed IPs. So if you look at Wisconsin in that bottom right-hand facet map, it's the pinkish color, you can see that it's a relatively low count. And you can compare that to maybe the Maryland facet, which is right next to it. You can see this kind of downward sloping angle. So that is likely due to the probably rural characteristics of counties that have high degrees of white persons as a percentage. That's probably what's happening. And we find that there is this kind of relationship between population income and the white percentage in that county. Conversely, if we take a look at Black persons in county as a percentage, we find the opposite. We find that as you increase the percentage of Black persons in a county, there's a higher level of deployed IP infrastructure. So you do get this kind of negative or the reverse correlation. And so what we found is that, and this is likely due to maybe the more metropolitan nature, for at least where we were sampling, we find this kind of relationship. So it tells us right off the bat that it's not a one size fits all, that it really kind of depends on what you want to explore. Now, the other side of this, and I'm just mindful of time, so I want to make sure I get through everything, is this idea, all we've talked about thus far is just the size of the attack surface. But we also want to get to this idea of cyber harm. And so what I'm really getting at here is that threat actors, we know, are motivated to access networks in an unauthorized way to engage in a variety of consequences. And that can occur in a couple of different ways. They can try to take advantage of certain services that are maybe predisposed to attack and compromise. But they also may want to take advantage of maybe weaknesses, so-called vulnerabilities in exposed services on the attack surface. So we wanted to explore both of these. So just looking at specific services of interest, we find something really quite interesting. We find that we went out and took a look at what hackers are doing. We took a look at hacker tradecraft and noticed that there were very specific services that are predisposed to attack, including domain name system or MS SQL, which is a database protocol. And what we did is we constructed a scoring system where we looked at deployed infrastructure, and if they had services that included any one of these, they effectively got a point by group. And so if you had a score of 0, that meant that you didn't have any services that were included here. But if you had a score of 4, that means that you've got one of these services in each group. So you can see the map at the very bottom here, this kind of range from green to basically dark red. And you can see very quickly that it is not a uniform picture across the United States. It's actually, quite different. And so you see this kind of range both by region as well as by state, which is quite interesting. And so we wanted to kind of explore this based on kind of demographic information we were able to pull from those counties. And so we noticed that, again, when you increase the amount of population, specifically the concentration of the population in the county, you have a higher number of exposed services of concern. And this probably makes sense or it does make sense because as you increase the number of people, the demand for digital services increases, which lends folks to open up additional services that might be necessary, and that opens up potential vulnerability. The strength of that correlation is going to vary by state when you look at like Maryland, Florida versus Arizona and Wisconsin. And that's likely due to the characteristics of the state. A couple of these are going to be more rural, others are going to be a little bit more metropolitan. So we see this kind of relationship. So the other side of this is vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities are weaknesses in software. And again, we collect all this data by county, and we find that there's kind of a difference between counties and by states. So we want to ask ourselves, what do we think is going on here? If we look at population size, we see this positive relationship, but it's really weak, right? It's effectively almost 0 between population and the number of exposed vulnerabilities, and that becomes a real issue. Let me come back here. Sorry about that. When we actually start looking at our regressions and looking at what might be generating impacts to things to cyber harm, what we find is that population and education have a statistical relationship, but the amount of variation that we're actually capturing in our model is relatively low, right? So population, education seem to matter. More people, the better educated they are, maybe the more services that they open up. But we're not capturing a lot of the variation in our scoring. Exposure to vulnerabilities is even less explained. We don't see a lot of significance in our variables, including in population, and our ability to account for the variation is effectively close to 0. So we're not seeing a lot of the characteristics that we were initially exploring really coming out in CVE count, and that may be due to an increased attention by policymakers specifically on CVEs. That's kind of one of the areas that we spend a lot of time in cybersecurity trying to manage. So how might race factor? Well, counties with higher percentages of white persons are associated with lower serious service scores. Makes sense. You have a smaller amount of infrastructure deployed, so you don't have as many services in general deployed. So it's likely that we're not going to see that exposure. We actually don't really see any sort of significant explanation for vulnerabilities either. So, both of these neither one of them were all that surprising, but it was something that we certainly wanted to take a look at. So what we're finding through the course of this entire explanation is that the patterns of deploying infrastructure are likely primarily tied to rural populations with higher degrees of white population concentration. So it has less to do with race and more to do with population and population concentration, the demand for digital services, at least based on kind of what we're seeing here. Higher counties with higher percentages of Black persons, we actually do see associate with higher service scores. So again, this makes sense. If you have, if what you're actually talking about are different population concentrations and demand for digital services, then based on what we were seeing with deployed infrastructure, this would make sense. But again, it's important to notice that there are these kind of differences when you look at these various groups. So what are some of the key insights? And I'm trying to wrap up here. Is that we see that there is a very large and heterogeneous attack surface across county government for services, with a disparate, kind of number of exposed services across the county. What we're typically finding in this initial kind of evaluation of the data, and I really highlight that this is still early days, is that highly populated counties that are racially mixed with higher incomes are really correlated with larger attack surfaces and the potential exposure to harm. Less populous, homogeneous, likely rural, tend to have smaller attack surfaces. And so, we do find some evidence that persons of color, and this is the key point, that reside in more populous counties face greater exposure to harm. And the big question that we have and where we'd like future direction to go is to really test that hypothesis by looking at more rural states with higher concentrations of persons of color, places like Alabama and others, certain counties where we're actually going to be able to test this. And really starts opening up the question of, is there this kind of rural and metropolitan divide? And as we start trying to bring in more digital services more generally across the country, does that open the potential for vulnerability in more rural communities? So policy relevance, there are key questions that are facing kind of general government organizations on how to invest their scarce resources. And so by assessing size and vulnerability of various county services, we can provide maybe a ranking for federal and state dollars. And right off the bat, population measures may not actually be a bad first effort, for allocating resources. And especially when 40% of the variation to exposed services of concern is effectively identified just by looking at population and income measures. So this approach might also be really, really helpful is we want to expand other sectors. So not just looking at county services, but transportation, power grids, healthcare. We can generate a larger integrated attack surface map. So, and it really speaks to the need to ensure that we have secure service deployment in these kind of rural counties. My final slide here is future direction. We're really looking at expanding this this effort from looking at a deep dive of 6 states to all 50. We want to be able to kind of also explore difference in budget allocation in counties. How does that make a difference? Because our guess is that actually explains, most likely quite a bit of variation. So we'd like to explore that and really kind of expand across additional infrastructures. We also want to have a better understanding of kind of the independent variable measures that we're leveraging. I highlight that this has really been exploratory. There's not a lot of work that's done in this area, so we're really kind of taking those first steps. Happy to answer questions. Please feel free to send emails to either myself or to Bill Lucyshyn. Here are our emails here, and I will stop and hand it over. Oh, I think you're muted. I think you're muted, Wayne.
Hey, thank you. MCs do that all the time. I want to say thank you so much, Charlie and Bill, for this really provocative exploratory research. This is precisely the kind of, let's try it out and see if there's anything here, things we had hoped that these seed grants might help support. I would like to now invite Director Squires to do some commentary on this, and then we will move to questions from the audience. So as you have questions, please send those along. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much again for having me today. I'm just gonna try to get all the windows set up here. Well, that was super interesting. And, you know, I think all the questions at the end are exactly what we are asking ourselves. So, you know, thanks for summarizing my presentation. So my name is Netta Squires. As I was introduced earlier, I'm the Director of Local Cybersecurity. And just a little bit of background about the role. You know, historically, the state has a responsibility to maintain state systems. And in 2022, some legislation was passed to create this role of Director of Local Cybersecurity, as well as a cyber preparedness unit under MDEM, really with an effort to think of things from a whole of state approach, right? Understanding that the state is larger than just the state infrastructure, and that we are all interconnected and interdependent, and really try to provide some insight. So our portfolio is our counties, municipalities, public school systems, and then all the sub infrastructure that falls underneath them, right? Looking at our 911 centers and everything underneath them. So just taking a look a little bit of our demographics in Maryland. You know, we have a population size of 6 million, 24 counties, of which 18 are defined as rural under Maryland law. Although if you look at the CISA's definition, it is actually populations with 50,000 population size of 50,000 or less. And so that changes the numbers a little bit. We have 24 public school systems, and just kind of looking at a little bit of the very highlights of the critical infrastructure that does that exist in Maryland. So right, so 24 911 centers, one for each county. We have 174 municipalities, right? So these are municipalities falling underneath the counties that are far smaller and far less resourced, but still yet their own governments. We're a home rule state. And then 48 hospitals as of 2021, and you can see over 3,000 regulated water and wastewater systems, over 42 power plants. So there's a lot of critical infrastructure within the state of Maryland, not to mention we are home to several federal organizations that sit in our state. So as we look at that, you know, thinking of rural jurisdictions, this is the state's definition for a rural jurisdiction. And that's really kind of looking at that geographic isolation, right? That lack of transportation, access to available healthcare. And as I mentioned, 18 out of our 4 jurisdictions or 24 jurisdictions do fall underneath that definition. That again changes depending on who you're asking your population size. So if we're looking at the 50,000, then we only have as a measure of population of rural jurisdictions, then we're really only looking at about 6 or 7 counties that fall underneath that threshold. So in 2023, November of 23, we conducted, the federal government put out a grant called the State and Local Cybersecurity Grant Program, which is managed by CISA and FEMA. And under that grant, 80% of the funds need to go to local jurisdictions, 20% go to the state, and 25% of that need to go out to rural jurisdictions. So part of it was perfect timing with my coming into this position, because part of that was trying to really understand what are the needs, what are the gaps, what exists, what is the landscape within Maryland. So we conducted a survey to start trying to help understand some of those questions so that we can make these funding decisions and allocate our resources, however scarce they are, to these to the needs. Out of our survey, at the time we did not have very robust presence. Our Department of IT, or our MLCC, Maryland Local Cybersecurity Collaborative, within the state. We were just starting to get those efforts off the ground. So by the time we only had 37 respondents, but still you can see of those, we had our public schools, our counties, higher education, and municipalities. And you can actually see that the majority of our responders do fall within that rural jurisdiction population base. So within that 0 to 50,000, that is the majority of the responders that responded to the survey, which was interesting. So one of the questions that we asked were, how many dedicated cybersecurity employees do you have in your organization? And we noted that a very large percentage, over 50%, had one or less people with cybersecurity expertise, right? So if you look, many had 0, but for those who have 1, often that person is also the CIO, which is the Chief Information Officer, also the CISO, which is the Chief Information Security Officer. They're also the Data Privacy Officer, as well as the captain of the police station, as well as wearing several other hats. Many of these also have water, wastewater, or other critical infrastructures under their jurisdiction. And so now you're talking about OT, operational technology, and industrial control systems, ICS. And so that is a lot of hats to wear for one person who has to be responsible for that tremendous amount of infrastructure security responsibility under the one person. Very few jurisdictions had a larger team of dedicated cybersecurity professionals. We also asked about budget, right? So how much money does your jurisdiction get, and how much of that is dedicated to IT? And then we also asked how much of that is dedicated to security. And when you look at the responses, the blue is the overall budget. The IT budget is that little red sliver on the top. And you actually can't even see the cybersecurity budget because it is so minimal, right? So the actual budget for security that is allocated is almost non-existent compared to not just the IT budget, but also in comparison, of course, to the non-IT budget. And you can kind of see here, we try to make it a little clearer spending on cybersecurity. So you can see that the majority actually do not even have a dedicated cybersecurity budget, but they kind of folds into their regular IT budget sometimes. So sometimes it's a matter of just being hard to define what a security budget is versus your general IT, and some have very minimal funding associated with it. Another question we asked was, are you responsible for any critical infrastructure, right? So going back to Dr. Harry's 16 sectors of critical infrastructure defined by CISA, these are those sectors, and you can see, as I said, many are responsible for water and wastewater systems. And again, that is the same person who's also responsible for all of county IT, and the same person that wears all these multiple other hats. Some have healthcare services, many have obviously transportation, everyone has 911 systems, and so forth. So it's important to kind of take a step back and think about, what are some of the main causes for cybersecurity vulnerabilities, right, as we look. So as you can kind of, some are very obvious, right? And some of it is really use of these outdated software that no longer has security updates and leaves systems very exposed to known exploits. And often it's just poor practices, right? So weak passwords, insufficient network security measures, lack of regular audits, for example. And then human error, right? So we have, your accidental data leak and misconfigured settings, but also, people clicking on malicious links, but also insider threats, right, are definitely something that is something we have to think about. And then insufficient security training, right? So without these regular trainings that we now are all becoming accustomed to go through, a lot of people don't recognize a cyber threat and therefore expose sensitive information or click the link. We have advanced persistent threats, of course. So these are highly targeted attacks from sophisticated actors that can exploit even sort of very small cybersecurity gaps or very gaps in security and go undetected for a long period of time. And then lack of encryption is another big one. So failure to encrypt data that can lead to vulnerabilities, making it easier for attackers to access and exploit the personal information. So the reason I bring this up is because when we look at especially our more vulnerable communities, and whether that is because they have a larger attack surface, to Dr. Harry's point, or whether that is because they are under-resourced, right? We really see a correlation between vulnerability to that also socioeconomic status, right? So what happens is that jurisdictions that have less tax space, right, also have less resources, and then also aren't able. So we're looking at it from two sides. One is the user, and one is the system, right, that the government. And so if you think about the user, if you think about people that have lower economic backgrounds, they tend to depend more on less reliable sources for cybersecurity information. For example, they'll, talk to friends rather than authoritative or institutional sources. And this can obviously result in a lower level of cybersecurity awareness and potentially greater vulnerability. We also, if you look at the systems, they're rely heavily. So these organizations can rely heavily on outdated security measures and, like basic firewalls and antivirus that is outdated, legacy systems, a lot of, much more outdated things that don't have patches anymore, that should be end of life systems, but they don't have the funding to change this. And then, of course, maintenance, right? That's another big factor. So if we look at jurisdictions that have less funding, their maintenance is often deferred and financially constrained because they just can't afford it. So as we're looking at making these decisions from our perspective, we look at obviously some of these factors, right, and understanding the landscape, of course, but then trying to really make that decisions prioritization based on vulnerability, but also impact, right? So funding based on the severity of the vulnerability, right, risk at the end of the day, and the potential of the impact, and how much critical infrastructure could be impacted. And these are just some of the considerations that, as Dr. Harry mentioned, that we have to take into consideration as we are going through these decision-making process. So some of the Maryland initiatives that we're doing in order to taking everything that we've heard and said into consideration and understanding that the resources are very scarce. We're trying to think of things as, like I said at the beginning, of this whole of state approach, right? And so how can we think of the system instead of just the state, just look at it as all of government together? And with that comes collective defense, right? Understanding that if we information share between us and collectively, we are going to be a lot more better prepared than if everyone has to set up their own defense mechanism. We're also trying to leverage economies of scale. So realizing that, if you have a jurisdiction of 400 people or 19,000 people, you may not be able to afford a certain system. But if multiple jurisdictions come together and band together and are able to buy a resource together, then they can now leverage better pricing and be able to afford it at a price which their jurisdiction can afford. And then one really important thing, which really, I know Dr. Harry's team that is what they do, is this continuous vulnerability scanning, right? Because it is tremendously important at the vulnerability of today, even if we manage to patch it, which unfortunately we don't always, tomorrow's there's a new one, and there's a new way to get in, and there's a new exploit, and there's a new indicator of compromise, and a new threat and attack vector. And so making sure that we continuously monitor systems using various partners or tools in order to do that continuous monitoring is something that is very important to the state for our locals to be able to be engaged in and be a part of, so that we can have a better understanding of our attack surface. And then with that is that continuous assessment and remediation, right? So we're monitoring the vulnerability attack surface, but we're also trying to understand our systems, our processes, our procedures, our infrastructure, our tools, and how those, our governance get measures, and then how those, how we assess those, where we score in maturity scale, and how do we remediate those. And a lot of the way that our Maryland does that is by implementing laws and policies that require meeting the state minimum cybersecurity standards, for example, or require and then setting what those standards are, right? Or require doing assessments by a third-party assessor every other year, requiring having emergency and preparedness and response plans. So kind of, I know we're hitting time, and I want to make sure we have time for questions, but bottom line is that quantitative data from demographic and cybersecurity analysis can really guide more informed decisions about that resource allocation. And that's crucial for maximizing the effectiveness of the limited resources that we have to be able to support our communities, right? And so, how do we, at the end of the day, how can we better, some of the questions we're asking as well as how can we better collaborate and coordinate with our academic partners to answer some of these questions? How can we take the data, for example, that Dr. Harry research has presented, and help that guide our decision making, right? Like, are we doing it all wrong? Going back to that state and local cybersecurity grant program, if we're actually saying that 25% of those funds must go to rural jurisdictions, but we are seeing that from a vulnerability perspective, actually our larger jurisdictions are the ones that are getting more hit. Are we thinking about this incorrectly? So taking this proactive defense posture and understanding the community specific risks, we as policymakers and strategy, we can really proactively establish these defenses rather than just being reactive when they occur. So we're happy to take any questions, and happy to continue our collaboration with Dr. Harry's team.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Reminder to folks in the audience to please drop questions in the Q&A. Audience sometimes needs a little bit of warm-up, so I wonder if you folks might have a question for each other on the panel, particularly around the role in data, how it's acquired, how it's assessed, and how it's used to make exactly those kinds of decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to jump in. Netta, you and I obviously we talk an awful lot about this problem. How are you going about like trying to gather the kind of vulnerability data? I know you have several programs, but I'm wondering if you might be able to kind of enlighten for the rest of the group, like how you're actually trying to bring that all together, because that's a really hard problem.
Yeah, sure. So we have multiple avenues from which we do this. So one is really, we have our MD ISAC, which is our Maryland Information Sharing and Analysis Center, and they monitor all of our state systems, but also many of our locals that sign up for the program, that sign up for the MD ISAC. We also have we rely on the MS ISAC, which is the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, and we really encourage jurisdictions to sign up to these free and available resources that provide them with alerts when these vulnerabilities are created. Another way is through SoCI services. Again, another cyber hygiene service is another way to do that. So, we try to be vendor agnostic, so to speak, in the sense of who's doing, and then of course that's just external, right? And so we, obviously also highly encourage and want to see jurisdictions doing regular internal vulnerability scanning, but those tend to be paid services through vendors. And then we really rely on at the state level, we have a much more established process internally, but we really rely on trying to help with that education piece and getting jurisdictions to sign up to these services. And part of our program that we're building is actually going to require being signed up to a vulnerability scanning and then being able to go through those results and understand, how do we help you build a remediation plan to take care of those. But it's a challenge.
Great. While the questions are coming in, I will take some prerogative and ask one. So in terms of finding the most effective outreach for education and awareness in the space, now you just presented this notion of Maryland as a whole state, interoperating at all levels across the state. Charlie, you kind of raised the question that there are some areas that have surprisingly large attack surfaces that fall below the awareness of our major cities in the US, right? So these small towns. Is a US Conference of Mayors or equivalent collection of county executives a right place to get these discussions happening between folks at the state level?
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question or point that you raised, Wayne. So giving an example, I won't tell you the specific jurisdiction, but there is a location in Wyoming. It's like one of the least populated states in the entire United States. And their attack surface is a small little county. I mean, I think they had a couple thousand people. They had something like 20,000 devices that are like deployed. Now, it turns out that there are a lot of like IoT systems that are kind of like, deployed out, actually communicating over the internet, but that's a huge attack surface for this small little county. And I don't think it really came to a lot of people's awareness because it's not around a large metropolitan organization. So I did a presentation to the National Governors Association and used this as an example. And it was surprising to hear as many CISOs note that like they actually weren't surprised. They were like, yes, we just don't oftentimes get enough information, even within our own state, but also between states. That there's, this is kind of an area that needs to be developed. So I think you have a lot of really well-intentioned people that are really trying to get their arms around this really difficult problem, but there's so much information. Trying to put context to it is, I think, one of the biggest challenges. I'm not sure, Netta, how you feel about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We in Maryland, we have our MLCC, Maryland Local Cybersecurity Collaborative, and we built that as a place for everyone to come together, and we leverage our, equivalent, kind of what you said, but MML, Maryland Municipal League, and then the MACO, Maryland Association of Counties. But, so we have a lot of places in which we can put out the information, but to Dr. Harry's point, how we take that in is a problem, right? Like, how do we take all of that information into one system? Also, jurisdictions don't always want to share that information. It is a vulnerability at the end of the day. So they don't want to share vulnerabilities. And also, there's the challenge that at the end of the day, 90% of critical infrastructure is privately owned. So, we have these great relationships, across government, thankfully within Maryland. But a lot of that critical infrastructure, we don't have any ability to gain any access. We can't even place. So we have incident reporting requirements, for example, for local governments as well as for utilities. But that's pretty much as far as it gets. So that's only after something has happened, right? But there are no information. CERCIA is about to come out with the Critical Infrastructure Reporting Act from the federal. They're kind of going to do the same thing. But But that's after something's happened, right? The whole point of being able to see vulnerabilities in attack surface management at scale is so we can prevent it from happening to begin with. And so I think, taking research like Dr. Harry's and being able to take it on a more micro level, on a jurisdictional level and say, okay, looking at these IP, what did these actually correlate to? Like, what are these lists? Being able to drill down is very helpful and informative. And, if we could do that kind of at scale with multiple jurisdictions, I think we could get really interesting and great informative results. And
Fantastic. Would like to nudge our audience for a last opportunity for questions. I will ask a popular science question in the midst. So gain of function research is a little questionable in virology, right? For who might leverage that for good versus for questionable, nefarious issues. Looking at both this kind of research, the surveys done in Maryland, the extrapolated data at the national level, what are your thoughts as scholars in sharing this information? If someone really wanted to, say, disrupt life for Latin Hispanic heritage Americans, they could zoom in very carefully on water systems in a particular county to have impact. How do you, as scholars, kind of treat this information, its release and its use?
Oh, very good question. So we've actually gone round and around and around on not just that question, but how to protect any information that we develop. And even in the papers that we've written, we're very careful in how we treat this information. I will tell you that threat actors that are out there, specifically the more sophisticated ones, they're already doing this. They like, and in fact, when you take a look at a lot of the targeting approaches, specifically the Chinese and the Russians, they already applied this kind of network-centric warfare concept of like actually building out exactly what we're doing. So, and in fact, it's in doctrine if you take a look at it. So, what I argue is that it doesn't do us very good as defenders to kind of bury our heads in the sands and play siege warfare when they're playing maneuver warfare. So we have to, I think, prepare ourselves in this kind of new normal that we have to start thinking like this as defenders. So I think that's part of the motivation for doing this. However, that being said, I'm not very comfortable like pushing out aggregated data sets like out into the open to say, here, you can freely use this data however you want. So that does create a somewhat of a quandary for us. And the way that, certainly we plan on working with the policy community in the future is we do not want to publicly identify these things. Our goal is not to create a name and shame report to say, Maryland gets an F for whatever, or an A. It's really about trying to be proactive because, as Netta can attest, this is all based on trust, right? Like if I try to shame a particular jurisdiction, they're never going to want to work with me again. And so my goal here is to promote defense. And so we'll do this in a very responsible and through kind of a specific chain of custody so that we can try to minimize those risks. But really good question, Wayne.
yeah, I agree. And, I think the COVID-19 really, the pandemic really emphasized the digital divide. And we saw that, in numbers and how many people contracted COVID and, those who were able to continue working or not. They're in so many levels. And I think, cybersecurity is no different. Attack surface management is no different. It's just a different kind of pandemic. It's just a cyber pandemic, but a digital pandemic. But, so really drilling down and understanding where and why and which populations are more susceptible will really help us ultimately target funding and resources in the right directions. Appreciate all the work you're doing.
Hey, we appreciate all the work you folks are doing. This is fantastic. Thank you for keeping us safe and current. So thank you very much for the presentation today. I'll ask Rachel to bring up our last slide. Charlie, are you okay if I drop in link to your two MOOCs?
Absolutely.
Hey,
I would very much appreciate that.
so hey, if folks would like to learn more, there are many opportunities available at Maryland, including graduate programs across many of our colleges on campus. But two fun starting places, if you're new, are these two massively online Coursera courses that Charlie has put together. I also wanted to highlight that the Social Data Science Center, which piloted last year an executive certificate program in data literacy and evidence building, is returning this fall. So you have an opportunity to get back in. If you know folks, especially those who might be in small local government settings, learning how to become much more confident with the tools and techniques in handling this for their jobs and being responsive to their constituents. So the plenty of opportunities. Maryland is happy to help out Maryland and the state in these matters. Thank you, Netta and Bill and Charlie, for the engaging conversation today. We'll keep this going. A reminder to those who've joined for the call, we'll be sharing out the video, and Charlie's agreed to be able to share his slide deck with us. We'll send that out once things are ready. So thanks again to all of you, and appreciate this great lunch together. Thank you.